Well, g'day. It's me, Ken Coulson, here at Creation Unfolding. Glad to be back with you all today. And I have Dr. Marcus Ross again with me. And this is sort of part two. We're looking at William Lane Craig's book, The Quest for the Historical Adam. We sort of looked at the theological side of it last part. And today we're going to talk more about the anthropological side of things and how he views Adam and how we should understand some of the fossils that he talks about. So, Marcus, welcome back. Great to have you
Hey,
with us again. Excited for today's program. So, tell us just a little bit again about yourself, what you do. Tell us about Cornerstone, and we got a new book. So,
we do. Yeah.
Marcus is an author in one of the chapters in a Four Views book. Is that correct? And
Yes, that's right. So thanks very much for having me.
tell us about
Yeah.
yourself and a little bit about the book.
Thanks for having me back on, Ken. It's always a joy and a privilege to be up on Creation Unfolding with you guys. So, yep, for those who haven't met me before or haven't seen me on a video, my name is Dr. Marcus Ross, and my background is paleontology. I'm a fossils and rocks guy. And I was a educator for a long time. I taught at Liberty University for 16 years, where I was the professor of geology there and also the director of the Center for Creation Studies. I'm a young earth creationist, an evangelical Christian, and I live in Lynchburg, Virginia. Currently, I moved out from teaching, which is something I never expected to do, but I decided to hang up my academic robes, and I run a company called Cornerstone Educational Supply, which, Ken, you're kind enough to throw that up on the end of your video, so I really appreciate that. That's really kind of you. Cornerstone, my wife likes to say we're the science stuff people. So when you're doing homeschool work or you're a teacher at a Christian school or any school for that matter, and you're looking for the science materials to do your lab experiments or your homeschool activities, that's what we do. We provide the hands-on materials for science activities. So our business primarily focuses on building customized kits for different curricula. So if you're using master books or if you're using Berean builders, or if you're in a homeschool co-op like Classical Conversations, our company makes a lot of the materials that would go for co-op use for Classical Conversations and others. So that's the sort of thing that we do. And whenever I have extra time, I'm reading and trying to contribute in whatever way I can to the young earth creation movement in a positive and model building, a forward thinking sort of way. At least that's what Ken and I all hope that we're up to with creationism, is not just criticizing those with whom we disagree, but actually trying to point forward for a way in which we can understand the data from the world that God has made, given the record that he has provided with us in his word. So the most recent thing that's happened is just a couple of days ago, I got this in the mail. Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve. And this is a book that I'm really excited about because I'm one of four contributors in the book. It's a debate in a book style and published by Broadman and Holman. And they have this perspective series where they gather evangelicals from different perspectives on a topic and have them, present their case and duke it out with each other. So the other folks involved in this book, the editor is Ken Keithley, and he provides the introduction and forward to the book. The position authors are Kenton Sparks, and he presents a view that Adam must be viewed as a mythological character because he thinks that the Bible is errant. So unlike you and I, Ken, as evangelicals who hold that the Bible is inerrant and inspired, Kenton views it as much more like a series of sermons that have been given by people who are speaking for God, but really it's a lot of human speaking in there as well. So he takes this errantist view. And so he says there's no conflict between the Bible and science because we just can't take the Bible talking historically on these things. The next position in the book is William Lane Craig, who we'll be talking about today more at length from his book. So he's got a condensed version of his book in which he argues that Adam was historical, but should be placed about 700,000 years ago as a member of the genus Homo heidelbergensis, rather than our genus and species Homo sapiens. He also argues, as we debated and discussed a good bit on our last chat, that the first chapters of Genesis The narratives in those should be understood as what he calls mytho-history. So he's not taking them as straightforward history, but rather history that's been overlaid with so much mythology that you can't really tease out the historical versus the mythological parts. The third person in the book is Andrew Loke, and like Bill Craig, he is a philosopher, and his position is much like that of Joshua Swamidass, where Adam is a genealogical ancestor to all of humanity, but not the sole originator of our species. So he thinks God used evolution to create our species, then eventually created an Adam and Eve, or at least could have, whose progeny, once they left the garden, then filtered into the rest of the human population. So that's the way he thinks that we can say that we're all in Adam, as Paul talks about in Romans and in 1 Corinthians, is that we are genealogically in Adam, but we are also genetically and genealogically in a whole bunch of other people. So there were pre-Adamites and co-Adamites, but Locke doesn't believe that they are actually human. They don't qualify as human and being made in the image of God. So that's a way where he has distinguishes from Josh Swamidass. And then there's me presenting a young Earth creation view of Adam as a historical individual living only a few thousands of years ago. So I present the case for that theologically, and also address the scientific issues of anthropology, geology, and go through what I think are some of the scientific evidences that humanity should be defined rather broadly, more than just Homo sapiens, but not anything out there. And then the afterword is written by Josh Swamidass, so he gets to make a final comment on the ones that were presented. So, yeah, it's a good sized book. You know, as far as content, it's about 200 pages or so, and very substantive. You've got 4 well-established scholars, but a little bit odd. You've got an Old Testament scholar, 2 philosophers, and a paleontologist. So, what happens when they all get in a room? Well, apparently something like this. So,
well, I'm looking forward to reading it, and I think maybe we'll get together and chat about that book in the future together. So that'll be good. Okay, well, we are looking at Craig's book, so The Quest for the Historical Adam. We've done part 1. Okay, so we're into sort of the anthropology, where Craig looks at all the different hominins species in the past, and tries to sort of nail down Adam. So where should we start there?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about the whole setup of Craig's book is that the discussion of the hominin fossil record, of human anatomy, a lot of stuff about cranial capacity and cranial wiring, really takes up about maybe a third of the book. So for those who might be interested in reading this, the science side of things is actually a lot less in terms of content than the setup for his theological discussion. So it's really about 2/3, setting up what is myth, what is mytho-history, how do I read the Bible this way, how do I handle the New Testament texts, and all that sort of stuff. And then, it's already page 245 when you flip to the first of the science chapters. So you got to go a long way in this book. And the science chapters will continue for, really looking at this, about 100 pages, maybe 115 or so before he has, his summary, putting it all together type of thing. So it's a much more brief part of the book, and covers some things that are certainly interesting, very, very interesting, but also excludes some things that I thought really he should have picked up along the way. There isn't much discussion, for example, on the overall anatomy of Homo sapiens, of Homo heidelbergensis, of Homo neanderthalensis. So he doesn't ever really get into how do we identify these species anatomically. He just kind of already takes that these are the way that it is, and focuses especially on a couple of key things that he thinks are going to adjudicate between who can qualify as humans and who isn't. So that would be kind of like my first, if somebody's looking to read the book, it's there's going to be some science in here, no doubt about it. But it's not going to be as complete a survey, I think, as I was expecting when I cracked it open.
Right. Yeah, I noticed, I reread it through before we got together. There was a huge focus on brain size, cranial capacity.
Yeah.
that was massive. Took up a good portion of what he was looking at about which one of these hominins is going to be able to think the way that we do. So that took up a large portion of that scientific section. And he sort of was very, very reticent about a hominin with a brain capacity of 550 having the ability to function like a modern human. And he does talk about the sort of first Homo erecti, the Da Vinci skulls, and talks about skull number 5 specifically, that it has a very, very low, in his mind, a very, very low cranial capacity, and therefore definitely could not represent, modern humans or Adam. So maybe we could sort of start with cranial capacity and why we think that idea is not cogent.
Yeah, it's actually something that in the Perspectives book I talk a little bit about. He doesn't talk about it so much in his chapter, but going back into the book itself of In Quest for the Historical Adam, he spends an inordinate amount of time working his way through cranial capacity argumentation, and he's got a chart. Let me see if I can get the right page here. Yeah, there's a graph on page 269 of his book that shows, this age on the x-axis and blood flow going up to the brain on the other, and he plots all the different hominids on that. So this isn't exactly cranial capacity, but it's pretty close, because the artery that's coming up to feed the brain has got to be bigger if the brain itself is bigger, right? So one of the things I actually am not certain about, I have to go back and read the original paper about this carotid artery, is whether or not if this is really well distinguished from cranial capacity itself, or if we've got something that is, too highly connected between the two of them, and they're not really independent of one another. But nonetheless, what's really interesting is on that chart, you see a whole bunch of the hominids, including things like Homo floresiensis, which has very, very small arterial blood flow going up there. Smallest of almost anything. In fact, it's smaller than everything except for Ardipithecus ramidus. You got Homo naledi, which is really, really low. Also has a very small brain capacity. It's lower than most everything else. And so these show up in Craig's chart, and he really never talks about them in the book at all.
No, not at all.
So let's bring your viewers up to speed on those two organisms. So we were all familiar with ourselves as Homo sapiens. We've got Neanderthals that pretty much everybody's heard about. Homo erectus is a fairly early member of our genus of Homo, very widespread, known from pretty much everywhere around the old world. It's in Africa, it's in Europe, Asia, etc. Homo floresiensis was discovered and reported in 2004 or 2002, somewhere right around there, and was dubbed the Hobbit because it just so happened to be, in the middle of the Lord of the Rings movies that were being, made at the time. And this individual stood about 3.5 feet tall, and there were 3 different skeletons that were found in Lingbua Cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia. So that's how we get this name, Homo floresiensis. It's coming from Flores Island in Indonesia. So these are really tiny people, and they're adults. So we can take a look at molar eruption and tooth wear patterns to see, like, have their wisdom teeth come in, for example, and do we see wear from eating on that? And there is. But these people have a skull that is literally about like this big. It's cranium has got to be about the size of a grapefruit at most. It's not very large at all, far, far smaller than us. We have a cranial capacity of give or take about 1,300 cubic centimeters. So, a little less than 1.5 liters. Neanderthals are a little larger, shaped a little different, but they're a little bit bigger. And floresiensis is coming in at like 450. So it's like a third of the size of ours. That's really, really small. And yet it's an upright walker, has kind of weird looking feet and things like that. But it also seems to be buried in this cave alongside some tools, possibly fire use, but now it looks like maybe the fire was later. I'm not entirely sure. There's butchered remains of certain animals, but the stratigraphy inside the cave is actually not as well worked out as we had hoped. And it just came to light, I think, last year, that there have been other hominids that were recovered from this cave, but nobody knows what they are. The only thing they've got are some field notes in a local Indonesian dialect. So we don't even know what else has come out of this cave. But these three skeletons of these super short individuals, again, 3.5 feet tall for like a 30-year-old woman. And the interesting thing about Flores is that even when the glaciers were at their maximum during the Ice Age and sea levels around the world were extraordinarily low, you could almost walk from Florida to the Yucatan Peninsula at this time. Not quite, but almost. Flores, likewise, was still isolated as an island from the rest of the Asiatic mainland. So whoever got to Flores had to get there by boat. One stray person is not going to make it and start a colony of individuals, right? We're not asexual organisms. We don't clone ourselves in bud or anything like that. So you need to have a population of people that come over to the island. And Homo floresiensis shows what we often consider to be evidence of insular dwarfism. What that means is they became shorter on an island, insular meaning the island. So either Flores people boated their way over to the island of Flores, or their ancestors were bigger hominids of some genus and species. Maybe something like Homo erectus is frequently considered a possibility. Maybe Homo erectus boated and came over, and then over time that population became the small-bodied hobbits due to pressures of having to become small on an island without a lot of resources. So there's a fascinating story to tell about Homo floresiensis, and Craig doesn't talk about it at all because their brain capacity is so small. And yet, if these people or their ancestors got on boats, were making stone tools, were hunting large prey, we know that they were hunting small elephants. So they were small people hunting small elephants. The proportions are still almost the same. So it's still dangerous work. And we also have some other skeletal material of small-bodied hominids on Flores Island at another location, so little bits of jawbones. And likewise, there's a bunch of what look like very simple tools that are over there, what are called Olduvon tools. That's basically, I broke a rock, I've got a sharp piece, so therefore I now have a knife. You haven't shaped it, you haven't spent any time working with it, you just broke off a sharp piece of flint or chert, and now you've got a scraper. But nonetheless, there's that kind of evidence of tool making along with these people, and that group is never talked about by Craig at all. And he doesn't talk about Homo naledi, which is another small-bodied organism, this time from South Africa. All of its remains are found in a single cave to this point, in a part of the cave that is so deep and pitch black that you would have had to have tried to get there on purpose with fire. The remains are strewn all over the cave. And it's a fascinating situation that's still changing very rapidly, but it's something that should have been discussed, whether Craig thinks that they are humans or not. Both of these groups are fairly young in age. They're both around at the time when Homo sapiens is. So you can't just pawn these things off as being, part of our evolutionary lineage or some, ancient group of hominins that aren't yet human. There's humans around, and the question is, are they part of us or not? And I would have loved to have seen some discussion of that. And the only thing that I've ever gotten out of Craig during a Q&A that he and I had at a private meeting was basically, that's nothing. It could be just an ape. And like, well, that you need an argument, not just a supposition. Right. So Craig was very, very dismissive of naledi when I had a chance to kind of ask him about it, and I was kind of surprised that I couldn't get more out of him for it, but it is what it is.
So, so from a creationist perspective, how should we view the cranial capacity? Is it a real problem, or?
It's an interesting question, and the question is really of this sort: does being human require one to have a brain like us, or is being human something where we have a lot more plasticity to our history? And so, as young Earth creationists, most young Earth creationists view these fossils as occurring in the post-flood period. So Craig's going to put this long before Homo sapiens, or most of it is happening long before Homo sapiens. And they're going in their different directions. Some he thinks are human, some he thinks are not. For us as young Earth creationists, the question is really, in the post-flood world, are these members of the human family? Are these descendants of Adam via Noah and his family? Or are these, likewise, could they also be apes of different types, non-human organisms? So for us, I think, the best way to approach this is twofold. And Todd Wood and I, along with Pete Brummel, had a paper at the last International Conference on Creationism to try and talk about how we synthesize all these data to present a cogent young Earth creation perspective. So one thing that we can do, and one thing that Todd Wood and Pete Brummel, especially those two guys, and mostly Todd, have been doing is analyzing the data sets of these different hominids through a baraminological study, and asking the question, if we take all this data and put it into computer systems that can evaluate them, do we see clusters of things around Homo sapiens, which we know us, we're human? Are there things that cluster around us that are physically very similar in some way? And are there distinct clusters that include things that we know are not us, like chimpanzees and gorilla? And yeah, it turns out that there typically are a couple of big clusters. There's a cluster around us that includes things like Neanderthals and Homo erectus. Homo naledi is usually there. Homo floresiensis isn't. It's always all by itself, which is really weird. Mm-hmm. It doesn't connect with any of the other ape groups, nor does it seem to connect to us. So it looks really like a one-off. But you and I both know that when we come up with a cladistic data set that produces an evolutionary tree, or a baraminological study that has these clusters, these are hypotheses of relationships. Mm-hmm. They're not the final word. We haven't discovered the human cluster. What we have is a cluster that we think might be human. So we might ask another question, or another set of questions, and that is, are there evidences of humanity in this group? Have they left behind cultural artifacts? Mm-hmm. So for things like that, we might include tool making. Did they make tools that are more complicated than are made by chimpanzees, gorillas, or other sorts of things? Things that require us to think forward to like a shape or an item that I want to have. So not just a tool of opportunity, but a planned tool. Mm-hmm. And there's that. There's the question that I've already talked about with Homo floresiensis of like, what about boating, or exploration? If you've gone into deep caves like Naledi, or if you've gone out into the ocean like we know Neanderthals certainly have, we highly suspect that Floresiensis or its ancestors did, and we have some minimal evidence that even Homo erectus may have. Those would count towards being human. Did you use artwork? Were there other ways in which you seem to show society or beliefs about things like burying your dead? Mm-hmm. So by taking a suite of activities that we know we as humans do that non-humans don't, we can comb through the paleoanthropological data and ask, do you do any of these things? Mm. And when we do that, I think we end up with a nice cluster in the baraminology studies that is pretty well confirmed, actually, by a lot of these things. Now, the fun part about our discussion with Craig here is actually Craig's doing a lot of the same stuff. Mm-hmm. He's going to spend a lot of time talking about cranial capacity and kind of drawing a line that if you don't have at least 1,000 cubic centimeters, you're very likely not going to be human. Mm-hmm. He actually puts it about 1,100. He likes that number because that's the low end of what he says Homo sapiens is. Mm-hmm. And Neanderthals is up to like 14, 15. That's their highest end. And likewise with us, our high end is actually beyond that. And Homo heidelbergensis has members that also fit in around that 1,100. So he's kind of said, okay, this cranial capacity, you need this in order to be human, because ourselves and Neanderthals, we both have a high cranial capacity, and we can see all kinds of cultural artifacts. So then he draws the line and says, this much, you could be human. You have less than that, you're not going to be human. Mm-hmm. And that comes out in some weird ways in the book. So I'll give an example of that. When he starts talking about tool use, I've mentioned these Olduvon tools. that are simple flakes. You've broken a rock, you've got a sharp piece. You now have a little scraper. You've got a little tiny pocket knife. So that's what anthropologists will call part of the Olduvon tool industry. And you also have things like hammerstones. I'm going to take a rock and I'm going to, break walnuts until I get to the stuff, or I'm going to break the marrow, break the bone to get a marrow. They're very, very simple. Now, you and I could make those. And if you and I were thrown out into the middle of the Australian desert and, you got one canteen, you're like, okay, I'm going to die. But if maybe I can live for a little while, we're going to look to try and make a tool of some kind. And you and I would be bad at this. And we'd probably actually start off making something like a little Olduvon tool. I got a sharp thing. That's what I need. More advanced than that are industries called the Acheulean tool industry. And Acheulean tools are characterized especially by having chips that are made on both sides so that you end up with a pointy thing. You've obviously made a point. The most famous of these are these almond-shaped hand axes. So they very much are round on one end and they taper down to a point on the other. So you've got a grip end and you've got a sharp end. And you can whack at stuff with this, or you can take a piece of wood and you can whack at it. And so you've got an axe. They also have choppers, which also tend to have a round edge on one and then kind of a flat axe to the other rather than pointed. But both times you're coming at both sides and making these angles. And he shows a picture of one of these in his book, and it's a gorgeous looking, beautiful hand axe. Let's see if I've got that picture here somewhere. And he considers that very obviously something that was made by a planned intellect because it shows beauty and symmetry and the type of forethought that's necessary. Like, I'm going to make this thing from a rock that doesn't look anything like this at all. And a certain kind of rock that's going to give me the tool that I want, right? And he praises that for, its aesthetic appeal. But then in the same paragraph, he denigrates the lesser looking versions of the same sort of tool as being, basically ugly. And so the ugly ones don't have to be made by real humans, but the beautiful ones, those are definitely made by real people. And I kind of think to myself, like, that's a really weird distinction to make. They're both hand axes, but this one looks really nice. It's the DeWalt tool versus Harbor Freight. Here in the United States, DeWalt is, one of our top brands of super awesome tools, and Harbor Freight is the stuff that is really cheap that you can get, and sometimes the handle doesn't stay on your hammer, right? They're pretty darn cheap, but nonetheless, they're both hammers, and they were both designed to do actually the same kind of job. Now, one might do it better than the other, but that doesn't mean that one doesn't qualify as a tool simply because it's not aesthetically pleasing. The same intellect was made. One person just spent a heck of a lot more time making really nice looking stuff versus somebody else who probably just didn't care as long as it worked.
Yeah.
And so I find that to be a really peculiar sort of delineation that Craig puts out there, that even the same tool, if it's made by someone he thinks is beyond that, below that, 1100 cubic centimeters, he's going to discard the tool as evidence of advanced intellect. It's a strange move.
Yeah. I mean, like you say, could just have to do with time. I mean, so maybe the earlier hominids were, from a creationist perspective, not quite settled, moving around, survival mode, and maybe the later ones just had a little bit more time on their hands. I mean, you could explain that kind of artistry that way as well.
Yeah, indeed. And even just personality wise, there are people who care more about these sorts of things, right? I might not really care. I'm the sort of personality that isn't going to spend that much time on making something like that. I just know myself. Whereas, one of my daughters, my goodness, she's going to make something that looks really nice because she cares about that. But I think you're also right that, once you've gotten yourself a couple of tools, right, and those tools are able to alleviate some of the other, work that you've had to do, it frees up some of your time, then you can actually work on making tools better. And I did get to that picture. I'll just hold it up to the camera here.
Yeah.
So, here's an example. Sorry, there we go. And, that is a beautiful Acheulean hand axe.
Yeah.
And so he notes that and says, yeah, this one definitely came from the mind of someone that is human. He dates that here at 750 to 800,000 years ago. So that's within his Homo heidelbergensis range.
Right.
But in the text right around that, he completely disregards things that are basically shaped the same, just not so nice.
Right.
Because basically they're made by Homo erectus, and Homo erectus, its cranial capacity. Maybe the later ones are human. He actually says that he divides the Homo erectus into the early ones and the late ones. He said maybe the late ones could be human, but the early ones clearly couldn't be, because they've got 600, 700, 800 cubic centimeters for their cranial capacity. That's simply too low.
Right. Yeah. He does definitely seem to poo-poo the Homo erectus, right, throughout his book. He gives examples of Homo erectus work, the things that they've made, but then sort of critiques that and pulls away from what he's just said. So I just thought that was interesting. I guess it's almost though he's already made up his mind that heidelbergensis is sort of where we need to draw the line. And although Homo erectus did create things, did make things, here's a reason why they can't be human.
Yeah,
I think at one point he talks about how we have trained monkeys in captivity to crack rocks to make these old one sort of tools, as though that is an example of what was going on in these ancient communities, because they weren't just cracking rocks, they were using them. Chimpanzees are not going to pick up those rocks and start to flay skin, or they're not going to start to use those tools in a productive way. So the two examples just don't go together at all. Having chimpanzees in captivity and training them to hit a rock is one thing. Having these other communities on their own creating tools and then using those tools, obviously, to cut skin, to break things, is two different kettles of fish. But he uses the chimpanzee example as a way of sort of poo-pooing the Homo erectus tool-making industry.
Yeah, and so one of the reasons I think that he focuses so heavily on Homo heidelbergensis is that I think he's fairly well convinced that this is, or at least could be, he's open to other possibilities in the book, that this is the ancestor between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. It's honestly, in anthropology, a pretty open question as to whether or not heidelbergensis is the ancestor to both sapiens and Neanderthals, the ancestor to only the Neanderthals, or really actually just an ancestral group of Neanderthals themselves, and not a valid taxon of its own. We have very, very little skeletal material of what is called Homo heidelbergensis. Most of the material that is assigned to it, and most of the tools that are assigned to it on the basis of its age more than anything else, rather than morphology. So when Todd Wood and I went early on in the Multiple Views book, we went down to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary for a gathering of the scholars who were writing, and a bunch of other people invited. And I got to take a wingman. I took Todd. The other author got to take someone along, and then there were other people there. And Todd actually brought along his cast of the original Homo heidelbergensis skull. Or actually, it's just a jawbone. This is it. The first Homo heidelbergensis is simply a jawbone. There are a couple other skulls that are assigned to it by some, but not by others. We also brought a whole bunch of other stuff. We brought, Australopithecus afarensis, Neanderthal, a couple of Neanderthal skulls. We brought a bunch of stuff to show people, what these skeletal materials actually kind of look like. And it was a lot of fun, because then we were getting to do show and tell with a bunch of theologians and philosophers who are like, okay, so what is that thing? Is that human or what? And, so we got to talk about that. But because Craig is kind of, convinced that heidelbergensis is there at this branch point between them and us, and he's convinced that Neanderthals and us are both humans, then therefore the common ancestor of them both is a human. And anything before that, open question. Doesn't have to be human, but it has to be at least heidelbergensis. Otherwise, if it isn't, you've got to, then you've got humans arising twice.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, there's no way that we can do that theologically. And I agree with him on that. That is actually one of the things that I think is really beneficial about Craig's book is he lays out a really good and positive case for understanding the Neanderthals as being human.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very, very rare among old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists.
Mm-hmm.
Exceptionally rare.
Mm.
Almost everybody is looking for Homo sapiens,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in Homo sapiens. And whether that's the reasons to believe model of Hugh Ross and Fuzz Rana, they say it's Homo sapiens, but only about 150,000 years ago, not the beginning of us, but later on.
Mm-hmm.
That's when we're culturally good enough. But they exclude the Neanderthals as being human. Most theistic evolutionists who say, if Adam lived, he only lived a couple of, thousands of years ago, or maybe a few tens of thousands of years ago, they're going to put Adam in Homo sapiens. And Neanderthals, doesn't matter kind of how much evidence of their humanity is out there. They're not thinking in terms of, well, if they're human and we're human, what do we do? They're like, nah, just, sooner or later they'll pull something kind of like a Swamidass view or John Stott's view that, God created a Homo divinus.
Mm-hmm.
He created an atom or a group of people that he now has a relationship at some point, but they're always looking in sapiens. So I give Bill Craig a lot of credit for expanding out the idea of who could be human and why. And I think he's got a lot of very good arguments actually for that.
Good. Well, so from a creationist perspective, I mean, how do we see all these different, hominids from the past? How should we view Homo erectus, for example? And how should we view the Australopithecines, for example? You just did talk earlier about a paper that Todd Wood and Peter Brummel have written, I think, the Baraminological study paper, and I'll put a view of that up on the screen, where they did distinguish between sort of what we should consider human from a creationist perspective and what we shouldn't. And so where should we draw the line then, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, for the audience listening, the answers that we provide are not definitive here. There's a lot that we still are discovering. Anthropology is going through an absolute golden age right now. It's amazing how much is being discovered and found. In the 1990s, when I was in, undergrad and grad school into the early 2000s, honestly, there wasn't that much. There was occasionally something new, but lately there's just been a lot coming out. So this is an exciting time, and it's a period of flux. So with that in mind, think about it. Science is always in flux as we discover more things from God's world. He's given us his word, and we've got that, but the world around is the place where he's hidden treasures to discover. Mm-hmm. So the Baraminological work seems to tell us that we've got more than one species that are members of humanity. And when I say species, I just mean biologically, taxonomically defined species. Anybody who I call human is actually a descendant of Adam and Eve, and we're using the term species here to distinguish what are probably, subpopulations of us, races, if you will, although their physical form is distinct enough that we can consistently pick them out in the fossil record. So it seems like these are peoples that definitely spent time away from some of the other peoples, but occasionally would intermingle and interbreed with them as well. We've got evidence of that. So the first three that we can say with great certainty based on the interbreeding connections is that us as Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and this group called the Denisovans, which you mentioned before. We don't have much for skeletal material of them, but we do have some bones, and especially from some of the bones, DNA that has been fully sequenced and compared. And it's a little more similar to Neanderthals than it is to us, but it's also definitely different than the Neanderthals. So it seems like you've got a cousin set there, or siblings, shall we say. They're siblings, and we're the cousins to those guys. But all of us have a little bit of each other's DNA in the other. You and I both carry about 1% to 2% Neanderthal DNA in us, and probably about 0.5% to 1% Denisovan. Some populations of Homo sapiens, especially Southeast Asian islanders, they've got as much as 5% or 6% Denisovan in them. So there's a considerable amount there. Seemed to be a large number living in the area of Nepal. So they were kind of in the route heading to Southeast Asia. So based on hybridization, which has always been a young Earth creationist indicator of being part of the same kind, we would be part of the same human kind. And we would be populations that had developed since Noah got off of board the ark. We don't have DNA from anybody else out there. There's some hints in the DNA analyses, actually, that there's at least a fourth interbreeding going on. But we don't know who that is because we don't have direct DNA from Homo erectus or heidelbergensis or some other ones that you may never have heard, like Homo antecessor. We've mentioned floresiensis and Naledi. We don't have any DNA from them, so we don't know what their contributions to us might be or if we have any. But nonetheless, based on the baraminological work that takes the physical form data and maps it out, those things look like they're very likely human. And we've got plenty of evidence of tool making in Homo erectus. They certainly traveled all over the world and possibly got out to islands. The island of Socotra, which is off the Horn of Africa. It's kind of, if you take Somalia and leave, which is a good idea for Somalia, get out of Somalia, but you end up in this little island, a couple hundred miles away. It likewise was never connected to the mainland, and yet there's a whole pile of old Avon tools there. There is a population that spent a lot of time making tools there, and it's in a thick unit of strata, so it's not just a little one-off. There were people there making tools for a long time, but we have no idea who they are. The time frame, based on conventional dating, would indicate erectus. That seems to be it. You've got Neanderthals that are on tools and possibly material from them in Crete and several other Mediterranean islands. So it looks like the Neanderthals were boating around. So another good indicator that they were human, because you don't see chimpanzees. Like, not only do chimpanzees not make tools and then flail skin, right? They don't make a sail out of skins. They don't make a raft and a big stick and try and push their way through the ocean. But somebody did in order to get to these places. Right. And that's a good proxy for language. It's a very, very good proxy for language, because in order to go out on a raft or a boat and survive the open seas, you've got to be able to communicate with the people on the boat and say, there's a wave over here, paddle left, no, harder, harder, harder. Look out, there's a shark or, some beast in the ocean. And by the way, land is that way. We got to keep going that way. That's the direction. So you need people who are going to scout to find some of these things, because they're not on the horizon. You can't see them from the mainland. Right. Socotra, even at its closest to the mainland during the Ice Age, would have been like 60 miles away. That's a long, you've got to get out there on purpose. Which means people have got to get out there ahead of you and then come back and convince your tribe that going out here is actually a good idea. Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? I mean, language is absolute.
All of this is going to require language. And so I think that with that, we have circumstantial evidence that things like Neanderthal, things like Homo erectus, if it was the one going out to Socotra, would have had to have had language. And others have made similar points about anything like Flores getting out there. You've got to cross 8, 10, 12 miles of open ocean. You might know that there's land out there. You might see an island, but you've got to tell people we can get out there amongst some of the hardest currents in the world. That's a dangerous, dangerous patch of ocean out there. So you've got those types of things, tool use and whatnot. One of the nice ones that Craig brings up for a tool is these things called the Schonigen spears. They were discovered in basically a peat bog in Germany near the town of Schonigen. That's how they get their name. And they're really long spears. They're like 6 to 7 foot long spears. And there's about a half a dozen of them or so, maybe 10, that were preserved in this peat bog because there's no oxygen in there, and so it prevents rotting of the wood. And some of these spears are actually weighted heavy towards the front. So they were throwing spears. So you'd throw them and they'd arc through the air and land down on something. So these were throwing spears. Others are pretty even. And so those were probably prodding, poking, stabbing spears. So they have a couple of different types. And moreover, the wood that was used to make them was wood from very specific types of trees in the area. And they were from fairly young trees. not taken from the core of the tree and not taken from the edge, but from just outside of the core of the tree. So whoever was making these Schonigan spears, Craig believes it's heidelbergensis. That would be the conventional age date that would match. It could have been somebody else, but heidelbergensis is a fine guess. You have to hew down the wood, select the kind of tree that you want, and then select the part of the tree that you want to make these spears from. This is really smart, super smart. I wouldn't, you and I, if we were left to fend for ourselves, we'd find the first long stick we could find and try and put a rock at the end, right?
Yeah.
And I think for us as creationists, that helps us explain a little bit of the progression that we see in the anthropological record, from these very simple tools to far more complicated ones. If people are either dispersed from Babel or when they're first coming out after the ark, and they are trying to make their way in a new world where we don't know where anything is. We're told in Genesis 2, for example, that around Eden, there were places where there was gold and onyx and good stones and things like that. There was discussion about what sort of metals and materials were there. We're told in the lineage of Cain that, members of his lineage are crafters of metal materials. So in the pre-flood world, people knew how to do metallurgy. They knew how to make tools out of stone, out of metals, etc. But after the flood is done, if you and I are right, and our creation geology colleagues are right about what happened to the world, the continents aren't in the same places. The rocks that make them up are kind of different. And that means that Noah's going to walk out into this world that is completely and utterly alien and foreign in terms of its geography.
Yeah.
And so you can't have a developed society until you find the things that you need to do that. I'll give your audience just a cool example. My oldest daughter was young. She was probably only 4 or 5. And we were reading a passage out of the book of John. And it was talking about Jesus going down to a town, right? So he's coming from Jerusalem and going down, because you always went down from Jerusalem.
That's right.
And they were going down to a town, and I said to her, they were walking there, and because, they didn't have cars yet. And she looked at me and she said, "Why didn't they have cars? Weren't they smart?" Right? And it was so delightful and innocent.
Yeah.
And I got to tell her, well, yes, they were smart, but the answer for why they don't have cars is actually kind of complicated, because, we think about having cars as just being what you have, right? And anybody who's smart, any society that's full of intelligent people should be able to do this. And they could, if they have the right materials, and if they have the right sources of energy that are going to be able to provide them with ways of making metals that you can't make with other types of energy, right? So Noah gets off of the boat, and they're going to be using driftwood for fuel. They're going to be using animal dung for fuel. They're going to be using whatever's out there. As things grow, they'll start using wood again, wood from trees that they can hew and cut down. But wood and animal dung are pretty much the main sources of fuel for most of human history. And the temperatures of those fires only get so hot. And because of that, you can only melt certain types of materials. So copper, right, the Bronze Age, is one of the first, because actually it's got a fairly low melting point. You can get this thing and work it at a fairly low temperature because it's such a good conductor. And it's only later on that we enter the Iron Age, because you've got to get hotter ovens and forges to be able to extract iron out of the rocks. And then you start mixing the iron with carbon, you can start making steel. But that really doesn't happen until the Middle Ages. You start getting better steels out of stuff. Right. And it's not until even later on that you discover things like coal at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Coal burns so hot that we can actually make different metals that you could never make in history before. And so the reason we have internal combustion engines is because of fuel sources and development and technology over time. So, but getting off of the ark, you've got none of that. What you've got is, I got to find a rock that I can consistently have a sharp edge. And that's not most rocks. You and I both know most rocks aren't going to do that for you. You're going to need chert, flint. You're going to need obsidian. Maybe you can do with a nice fine-grained basalt that's really hard. There's only certain types of rocks that are going to be good for this. You got to find them. And once you find them, you're going to make whatever tool you can.
Mm-hmm.
to do your job, and then later you can make a better tool.
Right.
Once you don't have to forage food every single day,
Mm-hmm.
once you have a moment. And Jamie Dimon, the noted anthropologist, talks a lot about this in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel. That he spent all this time with these people who are living in island nations or island environments in the Philippines and Indonesia, places like that, and their Stone Age technology. These are hunter gatherers who are using wooden spears and rope and things like that. Their technology has not advanced beyond the Stone Age.
Mm-hmm.
And his question was, why? They're clearly intelligent. They know every animal. They know every plant. They know the seasons. They know when this is going to happen. They know, how to read the sky for rain. They know how to do all these things. They're super smart. And his answer to this is, it takes certain types of food resources. It takes certain types of geological resources. It takes things to allow a civilization to build itself to a point where it doesn't have to be hunter-gatherer all the time.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't grow grain and store it, and if your food rots every day
mm-hmm.
because you're in a tropical rainforest, then you can't build a
mm-hmm.
society like what happens in the Middle East later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we've got people, Noah and his sons coming off the ark, either the group sort of split, I guess, and populated the earth, and then the other group became what we know as Babel, or they all went to Babel and they split and lost the culture. So, which would make sense as well if God confuses the languages where they can't communicate anymore. They're sort of on their own. Either way, you're in survival mode in a new world as well, in a world that has been completely obliterated, and you've got to start from scratch. Nothing is familiar to you. Mm-hmm. So, so that would explain why we see these different kinds of tool-making industries in the rock record for what we would consider to be, ancestors of Noah. That would explain that. What about all the different morphologies? I mean, we look around the world today and we sort of all look the same. But these people who got off the ark within, a few hundred years, people are looking really different. How would we explain that from a creationist perspective?
Well, that's going to get into a question of who is the first human anthropologically. So what does Noah look like? And throughout our history, most young Earth creationists have considered our physical form, like you and me, Homo sapiens, to be more or less what Adam looked like, what Eve looked like, what Noah and his family looked like. And, they major ministries will often say that, they could be like a medium brown color. They could have been African, as the progenitors for everybody else. But still, the perception was it's Homo sapiens. And Neanderthals and Homo erectus are like these deviations away from the norm that is our species, mm-hmm. right? And so throughout time, most creationist writing has tried to say, well, how did the Neanderthals end up looking the way that they did? How did the Erectines look this way? It was because of diseases. It was because of inbreeding, depression. It was because of malnutrition or things like that. The problem I have with that as a paleontologist, not that I'm an anthropologist, but as a paleontologist looking at humans as an animal, if you will, like looking at the bones and things like that, is these morphologies are very consistent. Homo erectus looks a certain way throughout most of its history. Yes, the brain sizes get a little bigger or smaller, but they've got a heavy brow ridge. They've got a sloping forehead to them. From the neck down, they look a lot like us. There's some minor differences there, but there's a good bit of consistency there. Neanderthals, very consistent with kind of an oblong rugby-shaped cranium compared to our, soccer ball. Football for the Aussies. See, I'm trying to learn my Aussie by watching Bluey. So, I'm doing that. I'm trying to help out, and my kids are liking it. Yeah, so do I. It's a good show. So Neanderthals, they have a different morphology. Their brains are bigger than Homo erectus. Their brow ridge looks different. They've got a different kind of jaw structure. Their bodies are more robust than either ours or erectus. Their bones often have, their long bones often have kind of a curvature or torque to them. And again, consistent. So these are populations that have built these morphologies not because of disease. Disease doesn't make a continuous, constant similarity. You know, if somebody says, "Oh, it has rickets," or "it had a vitamin D deficiency," that doesn't make the same pathology for each organism. So, on the other hand, you look at you and me as members of Homo sapiens. You look at anybody in the world from anywhere on any continent as members of Homo sapiens. We have this big, tall forehead that comes straight up, right? We get
Especially
surprised
mine.
we do this.
Yeah.
You're ahead of me, but I'm trying to catch up. The Neanderthals, right? If they tried to do this, they'd kind of like whiff it over the top. There's just not much there. Same thing with erectus. Same thing with heidelbergensis. Same thing with Homo naledi. Same thing with Homo antecessor, right? We seem to be kind of the weird ones with this big, tall forehead and no brow ridge. Right. We also have this nubbin of a chin down here, and nobody else has got one of those either.
Right.
And you know, in grad school, I remember reading, you know, articles or, you know, anthropologists trying to explain what is the survival benefit to the chin, you know, thinking very neo-Darwinian about it. And like, what's the advantage of this? Is it sexual selection, big chins? Like, come on. Like, so we're selecting for Jay Leno, you know, but not for somebody like it's
please.
No. But, you know, why do we have a chin is actually very, very more easily explained if we take ourselves originally as being something like a Homo erectus stock. And our jaws are much smaller than ours. Like our jaws are pretty much flat, straight up and down with our forehead, right? Face is very flat.
Right.
The others, their face kind of just sticks out a little bit. It looks like you kind of just grabbed you and just pulled a little.
Yeah.
It's called being prognathous, pulled jaw.
Yeah.
Well, the developmental pathways that control our mouth structure and our jaw, if those are programmed to shrink back, shall we say, they don't incorporate all the parts of the mouth. Actually, the chin ends up being kind of a leftover bit. And so this actually could be the place where our jaw ought to be. But you and I, as member of Homo sapiens, we've got a developmental regulation change that causes a short mouth, but left the chin behind.
Right.
Okay. But that would mean that maybe Homo sapiens was not Adam and Eve. Maybe Homo sapiens was not Noah. Maybe something Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, you know, we don't know who it was, but I, as a paleontologist, can a lot more easily see heidelbergensis, neanderthalensis, sapiens, floresiensis coming from an original erectus stock and going in these directions than trying to start with us and go to the other ones.
Yeah.
Lots of really hard, weird things have to happen in biology. And I think erectus is a far more plastic stock. So when we see the first members of Homo erectus in Dmanisi, which you mentioned earlier, that's a locality in the Republic of Georgia in far Eastern Europe. Dmanisi has these 5 skulls that have been found. They're called skulls 1 through 5. 5 is really weird. Really, really strange. You said it had the small, you know, the really small cranial capacity. It also has this hugely prognathous mouth. Some people don't think it's part of the other group. The others all look pretty classically erectine, and some of them even look a little kind of like Neanderthal, like kind of like they're on that trajectory. And so even if we take skull 5 out of it and say, let's just look at these 4, there's a lot of variation in there, and variation that can go in directions that I can kind of see becoming Neanderthal or us or what have you. You throw in skull 5 and say that that's part of the group as well, and you're like, wow, the first people here in Dmanisi are wildly diverse. And it's all in a location that is, it's the size of like a large room. The excavation location is only something like 20 by 40, 20 by 50. It's a small area. So it's unlikely that we're pulling in people from a long period of time, thinking like an evolutionist or an old age geologist. They seem to be fairly close in time, and they're very close in space. So it's very unlikely that they're members of like wildly different species.
Yeah, they're all the sediments. All the sediments that they found in that collapsed cave as well, from a conventional perspective, rapidly accumulated, and so they don't anticipate hardly any time in there, just thousands of years. So we're not looking at you can't say you had one hominid group come and then hundreds of thousands of years later another one came. So basically these people essentially location, geography and temporally were almost right on top of each other, right?
Right. And so what's really interesting also about Dmanisi, it's one of the earliest Homo erectus sites. It's dated at 1.8 million years ago on the conventional timescale. There are a couple other ones that might be about as old or maybe slightly older, but still you're looking at like about 2 million years is kind of when Homo erectus seems to show up. But especially right there at Dmanisi with this wild diversity, Dmanisi is not very far from the likely locations of Ararat.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very far from the likely location of Babel.
Mm-hmm.
And so if this represents some of the earliest people who have left and started repopulating the world, and they're this variable
Mm-hmm.
to the point where you're not even sure if this one skull actually belongs in the same species of all of these, but the researchers did something really cool. They did a numerical evaluation of these 5 skulls, and from the variation that they saw in those skulls, it was as big as the variation of all of Homo erectus.
Yeah.
And also equal in the range of variation of Neanderthals plus Homo sapiens. So whatever however you want to kind of numerically evaluate the diversity between us and Neanderthals, let's say it's this big, the Dmanisi skulls are as big. They don't quite overlap with us, but it's like nearly there, and we're about the same range. And so their supposition here is that basically almost anything that isn't Neanderthal or sapiens could probably get lumped into Homo erectus. So that would be antecessor, that would be Homo heidelbergensis, that would be lots of other things. That could all just be Homo erectus, because the 5 skulls at Dmanisi encompass like everything else.
Right.
And then you've got these other 2 things, and which they would say, you could make the argument that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are the same species.
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden you go from like 12 or 13 species of Homo to 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, sounds a lot like the way a creationist is thinking about things. That, what we have are people who are variations on the human kind.
Right.
They're all made in the image of God. They all come from Noah, but they're different from one another in the same way that a lot of the animals that diversify after the flood
Mm-hmm.
are really different from one another, and yet maintained the themes of their kind all the way through.
Yeah, which would make sense again in a catastrophist perspective, right? Apocalyptic perspective would make perfect sense. That you're going to have a lot of variation in bone structure, in morphology, based on survival. They were in survival mode, and from a again, a young age creationist perspective, and literally looking at the scriptures from a perspective on the ages, how old people lived till changed dramatically right after the flood, and maybe that had some impact on morphology changes as well. So you got a lot going on that would seem to indicate there's some good scientific reasons for why the morphology would be so diverse right after the flood. And why you would have all of these different Homo species, I use quotation marks, or these groups. So it makes sense from a creationist perspective, but what we need to do then is look at Adam a little bit differently as not looking like us. Look, we're sort of getting out of time, but is there anything else from Craig's book that you wanted to nail?
Well, I think one thing that we were just talking about here and thinking about the rapid period of time between Noah into the time of Abraham. Now, it could be hundreds of years, could be thousands if there's gaps in the genealogies, what have you. But, we're young age creationists. No matter what, it's short compared to, the couple million year period of time. One of the things that Craig notes about Homo erectus, for example, is that its tool complexities didn't change for like a million years. It just used Acheulean hand axes and Olduvon tools. And, he looks at that and says, that's evidence of cognitive stagnation, intellectual stagnation. They're just here, and they can't get any better than that because they're not really human. And once we get to Homo heidelbergensis, then the tool industries start getting better with them, with Neanderthals, with us, etc. But if the amount of time represented by these deposits is actually only hundreds or thousands of years, then this argument against Homo erectines not being humans because their tool-making industries were protracted, boring, isn't the case. Instead, we're looking at only decades and centuries in which people are adapting to their environment, using the tools that they can. And you might have the same exact people making Olduvon and Acheulean tools that are later making more advanced tools. It doesn't even have to be different species. It could be even the same members of a family, or it could be, you know, granddad was making these and we thank you, granddad, because we've got better things now because of what you did, right? We're all standing on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
So I think that's a thing to think about also as people might read Craig's book and say, you know, okay, what about Homo erectus and the tool making? Like, first off, I think the tools indicate solid cognitive capabilities.
Yeah.
And also in a young age creation perspective, this isn't a 1 million year period of bad tools or boring tools or simple tools. This is a pretty short period. And then we'll get to some other, you know, more impressive things. Again, there's a lot of good stuff in Craig's book when he talks about Neanderthals. We didn't get to talk here about symbolic works that the Neanderthals did, but Craig spends a good bit of time talking about not only the tools, but also things like Bruniquel Cave, which is in France. And seems to be that Neanderthals went down into this cave, again, pitch black, can't see your hand in front of your face. And they built these kind of circle structures in there from broken stalagmites and stalactites.
Right.
And not only that, but there's burn and char marks on a bunch of them. So it seems like they were lighting fires in the area. And there's like a central one. There's kind of these other small ones off to the side. And so you had to go in there and do stuff, and you were doing it on a consistent basis. It would have taken a while to make this thing, because you know you're breaking and shifting around rocks. And this would have been something that, you know, we might even call a sacred activity. By that, you know, we don't know what that is, but it's some sort of activity where they were going in and doing stuff. It was at least repetitive. And, you know, what were the kids doing down there? Don't know, right? You know, maybe they were smoking a weed of some kind. Maybe they were doing a seance. Maybe they were just, you know, building a little place for the kids to play when it was too dangerous to be outside, right? Maybe this was maybe this was a keep. We don't know. I have no clue, but it's obviously something. Everything was very purposefully arranged. He also talks about things like, you know, the twine that Neanderthals made. We now have this little centimeter long piece of twine, but it was strands of birch fiber, basically like a softwood fiber. And they twisted the fibers in one direction, and they took 3 of the fibers, they twisted it in the other direction to make a cord. And like, that's smarter than me. I don't know what to do to make a cord. Yeah. The Bible tells me that a cord of 3, you know, 3 is not easily broken, but I don't know how to make it, right? But
so these are conventionally, we're talking 500,000 years ago, something like that.
Yeah. 500, 400, 300,000, something like that. So Homo sapiens comes in at the earliest right now at 300,000 years ago. At the earliest. And isn't in Europe until, you know, 60,000, 45,000 or so, taking over Europe. So this is found in places where Neanderthals are known to be at times where Homo sapiens are not. So, you know, it's them. We find artwork. We find that they were using red ochre, which is constantly used by Homo sapiens in places for makeup and for decoration, for artwork on caves. And so, yeah, there seem to be things that Neanderthals are doing that are every bit as much as us. And to Craig's great credit, he basically lays this out and says, by what criteria could you possibly not call these people humans?
Right.
They've got to be humans. And if they are humans, they are made in the image of God. They are descendants of Adam.
Right.
He is committed to a historical Adam, although not the Adam of Genesis 2 and 3. He's committed to the Adam of Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians, which he thinks is just an Adam.
Right.
But, you know, that's why he's going to put Adam so far back. He's got to have the juncture point between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. That's heidelbergensis. That's why he spends so much time working on them and that cranial capacity issue, and ignoring everybody else who's out on the side.
Right.
And I think that's an unfortunate error. And I think it was a miss not to talk more broadly about the skeletal attributes that go into being human. Instead, spending so much time talking about brain capacity. And when it comes down to it, something I talk about in the Perspectives book, Craig's cranial capacity for Homo sapiens is incorrect. Our cranial capacity is much wider. We have individuals with cranial capacities all the way down to about 900 cubic centimeters. couple of skulls that had been sent to this scientist in Pennsylvania back in the 1800s who was collected this stuff, and all the way up to about 1800 cubic centimeters. So we've got a doubling in size of modern humans. This isn't anthropology as far as deep time. This is just present day.
Yeah.
900 to 1800. That's an enormous swath of people who we all know are made in the image of God. And
I think there are some outliers as well in where modern humans have had brain capacities around 500 cc, and they have lived perfectly fine lives.
And don't forget children, right? If you're trying to adjudicate who's human and who's not, and one of your main categorizations is cranial capacity, babies come out with small brains, and they start to develop human personality before their brains are fully developed. I mean, they grow very, very quickly, but nonetheless, boy, if you start talking about adjudicating things based on cranial capacity, and Craig will say, no, I'm adjudicating it more on the cultural artifacts. But as you mentioned, right, he spends a lot of time on cranial capacity, easily like an entire chapter setting this up. Right. So I think that's a mistake. I think that it's much better to look at overall morphology and to come up with some type of methodology. That's where I find Todd has been such a great advocate and such a great resource to the creationist community, because statistical baraminology is a method. It is a method that you and I can try out with data sets and run them and see what we get. We can tweak parameters on those methods in the same way that evolutionary scientists can tweak the parameters on cladistics and run different types of analyses using cladistics. It's a method that is objective and something that we need to consider in young Earth creationism. And I would also challenge old Earth creationist and intelligent design folks is that if you don't like statistical baraminology as a method, you need to come up with one. Right. Because doing things like what Craig does of here's how I know humans are human, and so you're not and you are, has been done by young Earth and old Earth creationists and intelligent design people on a lot of things. They're too fuzzy about their criteria. You need to establish a method that you can apply. And the scary part is that the method might give you answers you don't like. Right. I think that's where a lot of young Earth creationists and non-young Earth creationists have criticized baraminology is, yeah, but you got the wrong thing in your cluster, and so therefore the whole thing is wrong. Well, if we remember that the clusters are a hypothesis of relationships or a hypothesis of unity that can then be tested with further data, then we're fine. That's good science. Yeah, good. Let me finish with, we talked about putting basically all of these tool-making capacities, fire, in the caves back around 500,000 years ago, and challenging, I guess, old Earth creationist commitments, because, Craig, obviously, he's more of a theistic evolutionist. But if you're an old Earth creationist, how far back can you possibly put Adam? How much time can you stick in those genealogical gaps? And Craig makes a very, very good point in his book that you really can't stick huge amounts of times in those gaps. He's quite clear on that maybe you can put a few thousand years in there, but you can't put tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years in those gaps, which is why he looks at the genealogy. He doesn't look at it like we would look at it as a literal genealogy, right? Which is what you have to do. But for old Earth creationists who typically do accept the genealogy as a literal genealogy, and the way they get around Adam living, 50,000 years ago is by putting some time in the gaps. The reality is, when you look at the humanity of, certainly Neanderthals, heidelbergensis, and even, Homo erecti, when you look at the humanity of them, and you're an old Earth creationist, you've got to stick Adam 500,000 years in the past if you accept conventional dating. Well, you've got a really big problem with the way that you look at your genealogy. You cannot stick that time in there. So I think it's important, right? That's a real conundrum, I think. It's not necessarily a conundrum from a theistic evolutionist who really doesn't accept the literary reality of the
genealogies, but it's a really big problem for an old Earth creationist position. So
Yeah, I think you're right. You either have to say that the genealogy is kind of like a king's list. It's just going to give you a couple of important people along the way. But yeah, one time in a debate with Hugh Ross, I actually created a spreadsheet that would represent the numbers of people that would have to be inserted into the genealogies to get you to the places where he said Adam and Noah happened to be. And you've got 10 genealogies leading from Adam to Noah, and you have 9 or 10 from Noah or from Shem, technically, to Abram. And if you, for reasons to believe in their model as the leading old Earth creationist groups, you go back and read their literature from the 1980s, and they had Adam at 40,000 years ago, give or take. Now they've got Adam at about 150,000 years ago, plus or minus 50,000 years. That's the last writing from, say, Fuzz Rana in a compilation. So I've watched this number march backwards over the decades. And I've seen it go to 40. I've seen it say 60. I've seen it at 100. Now I'm seeing it at 150, right? They constantly have to keep pushing back Adam because they keep finding these cultural indicators of humanity in deeper Homo sapiens. They still want to say the earliest Homo sapiens aren't there. So what they have to do with the genealogies, because they take them seriously as you and I do, is say, like, there's no limit to the number of gaps between there. But it turns out that if that's the case, then with Adam at 150,000 years ago, going to Noah, just that part, there are over 800 unnamed members of the genealogy. And then because of the age of the patriarchs compressing down and getting smaller and having their kids sooner in the post-flood period, from Noah to Abram in their model results in over 1,000 unnamed individuals spaced out in the span of 10 genealogies. I don't know at what point you cross the threshold here, but you're certainly there at that point, right? Yeah. These genealogies are effectively meaningless.
Yeah.
They're 10 random people. Like, you got your first person, you got your second, and then you got Noah. Everybody else in the middle kind of doesn't matter.
Right. And you can't do that with the genealogy, because you can say the son of, it may mean it may mean the father of, it may mean the grandfather, but it certainly doesn't mean the grandfather, right? So there's a certain amount of meaning.
That's the argument.
In the term the son of, you can only stretch the son of back a few generations. You can't stretch it back that far.
I would agree, but this was the great argument that was made by Green in the late 1800s, when he said basically this construction of, so and so was the son of, we can say he was the son of, and it doesn't matter how many intermediaries there are. And so he said from that point on, evangelicals had a way of saying, we can't tell you when Adam lived. It was a way of protecting Adam from being falsified because Adam was too young.
Right.
And as the antiquity of humanity was continuously pushed, Green's solution was the gaps in the genealogies allow you to put however many you want in there. There's no limit whatsoever on that. I would think that biblically there might be some limits. You don't usually see genealogies, for example, that have more gaps than people in them. So on that count, you would say, you can add some.
Right.
On the other hand, if this is recording individuals and using those names more like kingdoms, then perhaps there could be more time. But those readings of the genealogies are more strained, right? You've got to do a lot more academic work to try and justify reading them this way than the easier way of interpreting them as what seem to be either direct or very close to direct father-son components, with the age of how old that kid is when they're born, irrespective of if there's extra people in between. When so-and-so is this age, this person comes into being. So that's the argument that was made by Jeremy Sexton in particular, that you can't decouple the chronology from the genealogy so easily. You can't, just because the genealogy can have extra people doesn't mean that the chronology changes. I'm not necessarily convinced that Sexton's right, but he makes a very powerful argument that those who want to put lots of gaps in the genealogy have got to address and address better.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, look, we covered the gamut today. So, Marcus, I just want to thank you again for coming on. It's been a great, gee whiz, we've really nutted at it today. So it's been great. basically, that's it. We'll wrap it up now, Marcus. Thanks again for coming on. And I guess next time we'll see you. Hopefully, we'll be looking at your book. So I think we chatted about that briefly. So hopefully that'll be something we can do next time. So everybody out there, thanks again for joining us. It's been a whopping great program today. I want to thank Dr. Marcus Ross, and don't forget to pound that like button. Don't forget to subscribe. There is a link in the description if you'd like to give. That'd be great. And look, if you want to share this on your social media platforms, that would be great too. It's really great help to do that. So until next time, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.